Hey everybody, Honest Dad. Wanted to do a video on the Iran War. It's day 10 of the Iran War, day 10/11, based on time zones. And I wanted to just kind of talk about how we got here and where I think we're going, and we have a few options where we're going from here. I'm going to talk about the strictly military component in another video, but I want to talk about the process of getting here and then where we're going. So everyone has a start date for this. Everyone usually goes back to, the Iranian Revolution in '79, or the fall of the Shah in the '50s, or the fall of the Democratic Republic elected government of Persia and the installing of the Shah in the '50s. I'm going to go back a little further. So the real first point that I want to hammer home is how Iran is technically really not a Middle Eastern country, and how Iran and generally the Persian people are kind of a different can of worms. They're outside of the sphere of influence of what you would usually consider Europe and the Near East. And for that, you have to go back really far. You have to go back over 2,000 years to the Battle of Carrhae, which is fought in Iraq between the Romans and the Parthian Empire. This is Rome's attempt to conquer Persia. The reason they want to conquer Persia is because Alexander the Great did it. And so Marcus Licinius Crassus marches into the desert with a large army, and he is utterly destroyed by a Persian army led by a guy named Serena of Parthia. And Crassus is killed, and they take the survivors back to Persia and have a triumphal procession. After this, Rome never really makes a serious attempt to conquer Persia. And so then for the next essentially 1,000 years after this, Persia is quintessentially outside of not just the European sphere of influence, but also the sphere of influence of what we would consider the traditional Middle East. When Islam comes, Persia is temporarily included, but very quickly Persia revolts, and they follow a new sect of Islam called Shia Islam, which again excludes Iran from both Europe, right, which it's been for a while, and now from the rest of the Middle East. And then from 1,000 years since then, all right, you have this quintessential development of the Iranian identity, the Persian identity, and Shia Islam predominantly in Iran, which is juxtaposed to the Arab, predominantly Sunni remainder of the Middle East, and then obviously, a Christian or pseudo-Christian Europe. When the 20th century hits, all right, Iran is one of the few countries that has essentially avoided colonialism, and so again, it's excluded. And the reason I mention all this is because understanding this current conflict, you got to understand that this is not so much the United States against and its allies against another Muslim country or another third world country. It's kind of everybody against Iran. So it's kind of like everybody from a certain sphere of influence against a country in another sphere of influence that has never really been part of the European and Middle Eastern identity. And so that's why I mention all of this. Now, in more recent terms, okay, we can start with the fall of basically the traditional Iranian government, which actually happens in World War II. So essentially what happens is in 1941, 1940, 1941, 1942, the Gestapo leads a pro-Axis coup in Iran, and a pro-German government is installed. This honks off the British and the Soviets, who promptly invade Iran, depose this government, and install a pro-Western regime. This is what takes Iran into the early 50s, when its post-war government is overthrown by a U.S. British-backed intelligence effort, and a guy named the Shah of Iran is put in. Now, this happens because the United States feels that Iran is key in its new strategy for maintaining power projection in the Middle East, which is called the Two Towers strategy. The Two Tower strategy essentially says the United States is going to dominate the Middle East by having two powerful, secure, and modern local rivals, one of which is not Turkey. And the reason it cannot be Turkey is because just recently that entire region has been under the yoke of the Ottoman, basically a Turkish empire, for over 500 years. Oh, and by the way, who was the predominant blood rival of the Ottoman Empire for 600 years. Well, that was the Persians in Iran. So Turkey, even though it's a NATO ally, cannot be one of your two towers. The first tower is Israel. When the state of Israel wins its war of independence and some subsequent wars, it becomes the first of the US two towers. When the United States looks around, they find that Iran is the best option for our second tower. Iran, like I said, it's different than the rest of the Middle East. The United States is smart enough to recognize that. It's a different sect of Islam. And on top of all of that, it has huge oil reserves, very strategically located, and Iran is very hard to invade because it's got a lot of mountains around it. The Shah rules for the next 40 odd years, 30 odd years. It's initially a decent rule compared to the dictators of other countries. In the mid to late 70s, it turns into close to a terror state. There is a massive revolution. This revolution is supported by some radical elements within Islam, but it's mainly supported by the KGB because Russia wants to knock Iran out of our sphere of influence. The revolution succeeds. Revolutionaries kick the Shah out. He runs to the United States with a bunch of stolen wealth. And then the revolutionaries then storm the U.S. embassy and take a bunch of U.S. diplomats and soldiers hostage. Eventually, Carter and Reagan, both of them can share credit and negotiate for the return of these hostages. However, this is where the most recent aspect of what's going on now starts, because when Iran takes control of the embassy, that's technically an act of war. So the United States in 1979 and 1980 had a right to go to war with Iran. But it doesn't happen for a variety of reasons. It doesn't happen because President Carter is largely a peacenik, and he abhors these kinds of wars. And Reagan doesn't do it because his advisors tell him that invading Iran is going to be a massive undertaking. Iran is 4 or 5 times the size of Vietnam. It's a larger population. It's a mountainous region where a guerrilla campaign against U.S. forces would be much more successful than it was in Vietnam. Oh, and by the way, it's right next to the Soviet Union, so the Soviet Union can support an Iranian war against the United States with ease. So the United States then decides to set on this strategy, and this is established by Reagan, which will hold true for the next 25, 30 years, of basically just trying to isolate Iran. So the United States shifts its favoritism from Iran to Iran's traditional enemy, two traditional hated enemies, which is Saudi Arabia, and basically, historically it would be called Baluchistan, but we call it Pakistan, right? So those become U.S. allies. We find ways of isolating Iran in around the world and locally. Eventually, we ally with all the little Gulf states like Qatar and Bahrain. Again, all of this is designed to essentially contain Iran in the same way we contain the Soviet Union. Iran, for its part, tries to export its revolution to a few places around the Middle East, sponsor terror. You've heard this movie before. They're largely unsuccessful. They're much less successful than Arab Islamist groups. They're much less successful than Al-Qaeda in terms of actually funding successful attacks or successful proxy operations. They do, however, fund some very serious and dire attacks on Israel, upwards of 50 over the period of years. Advance to the more modern period, okay? So you have this thought after the end of the war on terror, right? That the next logical target is Iran. And part of that is the neocons in the Republican Party on the right feeling like this is just the next logical target. And part of it, though, is that deeper thing that goes back to Crassus losing his legions, which is Iran is outside of our world. Iran is outside of our sphere of influence. It's not part of the Middle East. It's not part of Europe, right? It's its own thing. It's decently powerful. We need to rein it in. We need to bring it into the fold. Iran is the outsider. It's the demonic other, right? It's the thing on the other side of the imperial border, which immediately makes it the enemy. Iran is also rumored to be building a nuclear weapon. However, President Barack Obama is able to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal, which delays the Iranian nuclear program. Donald Trump was elected in 2016. Iran is not a major issue in that campaign. The issues are immigration and border control and the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the U.S. involvement in fighting ISIS. Iran is not a part of that election. Iran is not a part of the 2020 election. That's about the border. That's about COVID. Iran is not even a part of the 2024 election. That's about the border. That's about trans rights. That's about a whole number of things. So even though Trump just declared war on Iran, and don't get it twisted, this is a war, all right? Assassinating an entire country's leadership and trying to destroy their entire military is a war. Or whatever you call it, it's a war. This is not something that Donald Trump or his faction of the Republican Party ever really intended. They never ran on it. They were never interested in it. What got them interested in it? So first of all, again, it's what I've been saying this whole video. It's this 2,000-year-long thing that Iran is on the outside of what's going on in Europe and the Middle East. It's the enemy. It's the outsider, right? It's the country on the outside of the Roman Empire and the great Muslim empires. It's the country that's trying to, side with Germany against us in World War II. So there's always this feeling amongst some people. However, there's two other things. So the United States, members of the U.S. military and the government, never forgave Iran for taking control of the embassy and seizing our hostages. It doesn't matter that the hostages were returned. The U.S. never forgave that. And these are actual people. This is not a generational thing. This is actual people that were living in the 79 revolution on the American side who experienced it. They wanted to go to war with Iran in 79, 80, 81. They've never forgotten it. They have an axe to grind against Iran. They want to go to war. So those people are there, but Trump is not listening to them. All right. Then again, we also have this neocon faction from the mid-2000s that want to go after Iran because, again, it's the most and next logical target. We've gotten rid of Al-Qaeda, we've gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, we've gone into Libya and Somalia and all these countries where they have regimes we don't like. Iran's kind of like the last domino to go after. So that faction's there too. But again, Donald Trump's not listening to them. And certainly the Democrats aren't listening to him because the Democrats are operating under the Obama plan for Iran, which is to negotiate with them and basically maintain the containment of the country. So what changed, right? What changed to shift this power vacuum inside Trump and his advisors' heads? Well, it's two things. So for the large part, the faction of Republicans that's currently in charge are egomaniacs. They're not ideologues. They don't believe in anything, but they do believe in ego. And when Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu launched the preemptive strikes last summer to destroy Iran's nuclear program, and did a very, very good job at doing it, and the so-called 14-day war, that faction of the Republican Party, Donald Trump himself, were annoyed. They were embarrassed because they didn't get all the kudos. And boy, did Israel get a lot of kudos for that. They fought a quote-unquote clean war in 14 days. It was mainly an air campaign. They took very few casualties. They attained their strategic objectives without causing a big quagmire war, big battle, or whatever. Or that's what the surface analysis was. The reality of that was much different. All those Israeli strikes did was cause this war, frankly. But that's not what was heard, all right, in this faction of the Republican Party. What was heard was we got left out of basically the party. And so when the United States hears from Israel that Israel is planning another round of attacks on Iran, because Iran has rebuilt its nuclear capacity and it's ramped up its production of drones and missiles and all these things to fire at Israel, the United States this time is like, well, we want to get down on this. Okay, we want to get on this because it knocks down two birds with one stone. We finally get to settle our score with Iran. And we get to look awesome and powerful and get all the kudos that Israel got the last time, because this is going to be fast and this is going to be easy. And the Iranians are just going to surrender as soon as we hit them hard, because that's all we have to do. Because that's all we ever do to the congressional Democrats, right? When we're running elections against them, we just attack them, and the congressional Democrats just fold to our will, and that's true. That's how this version of Republican Party has been, kicking the Democrats around the field pretty hard. But that's a political party. This is a nation, right? So this is what moves in Trump's head and his advisors' head, right? They're not ideologues. They're not trying to fight a crusade against Iran. They don't care that they're Shia. They don't care that they're Muslim. They don't care that they're sitting on a lake of oil. They care that they slapped us in the face and embarrassed us 40 years ago, and they never got their comeuppance. And oh boy, they care that there's glory and that there's praise to be won. And you're a fool to think that men today don't still seek glory and glory in war. Men have always sought glory and glory in war. And that's what this is. They want the glory, all right? They want the revenge and they want the glory. And so that's how we got where we are right now. And so then Trump gives the orders, the military follows the orders. U.S. military is not going to question that. The U.S. military doesn't like Iran. They've been wargaming against Iran for 40 years. Israel's really excited because they've got, their big guard dog, which is the United States, backing them up. And by the way, the U.S. also scores massive points with Israel, which we are trying to maintain that alliance more than anything, because we need Israel in a potential world war with China, because we need their Air Force, the Israeli Air Force. And believe me, if there's a world war with China, the Israeli Air Force is going to be transported to U.S. bases in the Far East to fight the Chinese. Now, where do we go from here? So, wars like this I call them fork wars, because they can really go in a couple different directions. It can de-escalate. Trump and his faction of Republicans are, in the end, outcome-driven people, because a lot of them came from the corporate world. And outcome-driven people cut their losses when something is not working, right? If something is not working, they cut their losses, they fire somebody, they move on. They are not George W. Bush and Donald Rumsfeld, who are going to keep doubling and tripling down. They're not Lyndon Johnson, who are going to keep doubling and tripling down on a military campaign, because they have ideological beliefs. The Trump faction has no ideological beliefs, none whatsoever. But they are outcome driven, and they are smart enough to understand negative outcomes. So if they see enough negative outcomes in the military operation or in the press response, anti-war protests, complaints from allies, Trump will pull the plug. He'll declare victory, and that this was the greatest, military campaign in the history of the last 7 universes, and he was the smartest general since Napoleon and Alexander the Great. All of that is just propo and indoc. In reality, what they're doing, if they go that route, is they're pulling out. They're pulling out of a situation that's not going the way that they want, like most outcome-driven people do. Now, I'll say I actually respect that more than doubling and tripling down on a failed strategy. I mean, at least you're willing to admit that you're wrong if you go that route, which is the route I hope we go. I hope their self-interest and their intense focus on outcome-driven policies will pull them out of this conflict before it becomes disaster. But that's just fork 1. Fork 2 is back down the rabbit hole of Iraq, of Vietnam, of Somalia, which is what in poker you call pot committed. And what that means is that there's a point when you're bombing them and they're bombing you, and you're attacking their military and killing their servicemen, and they're killing your servicemen, that the cost of that, not just the blood cost and the emotional cost, but the cost in terms of prestige and honor and insults to your glory, because again, glory is so important to us men. Those insults to your glory get to a point where men they will just march off a cliff, and they will just massacre hundreds and thousands of people on their own side and on their other side as an ornament to their glory. And that's the second fork. And how's that going to happen? If Iran scores serious hits, if it sinks an American ship, if it shoots down a few pilots, if it continues to kind of get some major hits if it pulls off a successful terrorist attack on U.S. U.S. shores, that's it. The U.S. will double and triple down. It will come at Iran even harder, which will cause Iran to come harder at us, and eventually will require a multi-stage ground invasion or a nuke. So either one of those paths, not good, bad news. The other thing is on the other side. There's a point where getting embarrassed and getting your butt whipped, which is what the Iranians are getting right now, and losing your military and losing your leaderships and losing your entire navy and losing, all your missile capacity. There's a point where on the Iranian side where they say, F it, we're going to go all in. We're going to do anything we can to kill Americans, terrorist attacks everywhere. We're never going to surrender. We're going to make America come and invade us and pull us out of our mountain bases. And we're going to kill every single one of them that we can get our hands on. And that will lead to ground invasion, multi-year war, conflict between the nations without end. Now, who's going to win? Well, probably the United States. I mean, the United States is 70 times bigger than Iran in terms of military establishment. So, I mean, I'm going to pick the side that has 70 times more military capacity than the side that has 1/70th of the side. I mean, that's a pretty easy pick. But that's just the military side. What about the actual extrication of yourself from the situation and solving the problem? And what the fear is that policymakers will, in the Trump administration, will not make a clear break, right? Just, say, hey, we got done what we wanted to get done. The outcome has been, we see that the outcome is not being delivered. We're getting out while we can. Or they go the second route. They go the route of, well, we just got to keep doubling and doubling down. But they do it incrementally, which has always been the problem of the United States for the last 40 years as we go into these conflicts incrementally, which allows the other side to recover and cause some grievous damage to our services. When in reality, if the U.S. wants to fight a war like this, they shouldn't do it like this. The U.S. should do a multi-year or multi-month buildup, assemble overwhelming military capacity, fight the war and win it, like we did in World War II and World War I. I mean, there's no need to play cloak and dagger games and trick your opponent about when you're going to attack them and when not, when you're 70 times their size. Just get your guys, mass them, and storm. That's pretty basic. But that kind of logic is not really followed in U.S. military circles or policy circles, because in order to do that, you have to have most of the country on your side. You have to have people like me supporting the war effort. You couldn't just have a very small fraction of Americans supporting the war effort, which is what's supporting it right now. And they don't want to get that. So that's kind of how we got here. That's kind of how I think we're going to go. Again, like I say, it's a fork. I would not place a bet on which way we're going to go. My gut feeling is that the outcome-driven part of it will eventually get a hold of Trump and his advisors and they will pull out. But I don't know that for sure. Thanks, everybody, and God bless.